What kind of company could grow faster by becoming less specialized? In the 1960s, that question moved from the margins of corporate theory to the center of American business. Conglomerates began purchasing companies in unrelated industries, promising that superior management could turn diversity into strength. The puzzle was not simply why firms bought so much. It was why investors believed complexity itself could become a source of growth. Harold Geneen became the most recognizable practitioner of that belief. At ITT, he helped transform a company associated with telecommunications into a sprawling corporate system with interests extending far beyond one industry. The strategy challenged an older assumption that a company should know its products, customers, and technology deeply. Geneen advanced a different proposition. Management skill, financial discipline, and organizational control could supposedly travel across industrial boundaries. The mechanism depended on a deceptively simple idea called synergy. Synergy meant that the combined businesses would be worth more together than separately. Shared purchasing, centralized finance, stronger bargaining power, and transferable managerial practices were expected to produce that premium. But synergy was not a machine that automatically generated value. It was a claim about coordination, and its success depended on information moving accurately through an increasingly complicated hierarchy. The 1960s provided favorable conditions for this experiment. Economic expansion made corporate growth appear both achievable and necessary. Public companies were judged heavily by their ability to increase earnings and maintain momentum. A mature business could look stagnant even when it remained profitable. Acquisition offered a faster route to expansion than developing new products internally, and the conglomerate model turned that route into a corporate strategy. Geneen's contribution was not merely buying companies. It was imposing a management system designed to make distant operations legible from the center. Divisions could operate in different markets while headquarters monitored financial performance, demanded regular reporting, and compared results across the organization. This was an early version of a powerful corporate promise: local autonomy for operations, central authority over numbers. That promise reshaped the role of the chief executive. The leader no longer needed to be the foremost expert in every product line. Instead, the executive became an allocator of capital, a designer of reporting systems, and an evaluator of managers. The corporation increasingly resembled an internal market, where headquarters shifted resources toward divisions that appeared more productive and away from those that did not. For shareholders, the model offered an attractive form of diversification. Diversification means spreading activity across different businesses so that weakness in one area may be balanced by strength in another. A conglomerate could appear less vulnerable than a company tied to one product or economic cycle. Yet diversification inside a corporation was not free. Each acquisition created new reporting needs, new managerial relationships, and new opportunities for misunderstanding. ITT's expansion therefore revealed a tension at the heart of corporate growth. The company could reduce dependence on a single industry, but it also increased dependence on headquarters' ability to interpret many industries at once. A telecommunications business, a hotel company, and an industrial operation do not respond to the same customers, technologies, or competitive pressures. Their financial statements may share a language, while their underlying economics remain radically different. The market helped reinforce the model. During the rise of conglomerates, investors often evaluated companies through consolidated earnings rather than through the distinct quality of each subsidiary. Consolidation combined multiple operations into one corporate account. That made the parent company appear broad, stable, and capable of continuous expansion. The accounting view could be clean even when the operating reality underneath it was fragmented. This created an important asymmetry. A successful acquisition could immediately enlarge reported revenue and earnings, while the costs of integration might emerge slowly. The benefits were visible in corporate scale. The difficulties were dispersed across divisions, systems, and years. Growth became easier to announce than to manage. The financial architecture rewarded motion, and acquisition supplied a steady source of it. Janine's system also reflected a broader faith in professional management. After the Second World War, large corporations had become central institutions in the economy. Their managers were increasingly treated as a distinct governing class, equipped with planning methods that could be applied across sectors. The conglomerate represented the boldest version of that faith. Industry knowledge was useful, but disciplined administration was presented as more fundamental. That belief changed the meaning of expertise. A specialist might understand how to operate a factory, run a hotel, or develop a communications network. The conglomerate executive claimed a higher vantage point, one based on comparison and control. From headquarters, businesses became portfolios of assets, performance reports, and capital requirements. The abstraction was powerful because it allowed different activities to be evaluated within a single corporate framework. But abstraction also concealed what could not be standardized. A division's reported margin did not explain the relationships that produced it. A hotel depended on location and reputation. A manufacturer depended on engineering knowledge and supply chains. A communications company depended on technical systems and regulation. The same financial targets could be applied to all three, but identical targets did not create identical capabilities. As conglomerates expanded, the acquisition process itself became a source of power. Corporate leaders negotiated with sellers, bankers, boards, and investors, while the acquired businesses became units inside a much larger institution. The parent could promise capital, prestige, and access to a stronger balance sheet. In return, it gained control over assets whose future performance would validate or undermine the entire model. This was the hidden wager behind the 1960s mergers. The corporation was not simply purchasing businesses, it was purchasing the right to believe that management could overcome differences between them. Every new acquisition tested that belief. If results improved, the system appeared vindicated. If they weakened, the explanation could be placed on a particular division, a market downturn, or an ineffective manager rather than on the architecture itself. The pressure intensified because growth had become a language of legitimacy. A company that remained the same size could be portrayed as losing relevance, even if its existing operations were sound. Expansion demonstrated ambition to investors, employees, and competitors. In that environment, standing still was not neutral. It could be interpreted as failure, creating an incentive to keep acquiring before the previous purchase had been fully understood. The consequences were gradually systemic. More subsidiaries required more layers of supervision. More layers created delays between local conditions and executive decisions. More businesses produced more data, but additional data did not guarantee better knowledge. Headquarters could become informed about everything in a formal sense while understanding less about the causes of performance. That distinction matters. Control systems are effective when the measures they collect correspond closely to reality. In a complex conglomerate, the measures can become substitutes for reality. Revenue, margins, and targets travel easily across organizational boundaries, while tacit knowledge does not. Tacit knowledge is practical understanding that is difficult to reduce to a report, and it often determines whether a business can adapt when conditions change. The fall of the conglomerate model, therefore, was not caused by one defective acquisition or one managerial mistake. Its deeper problem was the widening gap between financial unity and operational diversity. The parent company could present itself as a single enterprise, but its subsidiaries remained exposed to separate technologies, labor markets, regulations, and competitive forces. The center claimed coherence that the edges did not always possess. As economic conditions became less forgiving, that gap grew harder to conceal. Slower growth made acquisition-led expansion more difficult to sustain. Investors began examining whether a conglomerate's combined businesses were worth more under one roof than as separate companies. The question shifted from how quickly a corporation could expand to whether centralized ownership was actually creating value. That change weakened the central mythology of endless corporate growth. A conglomerate could be large without being efficient, diversified without being resilient, and financially disciplined without possessing the knowledge required to manage every subsidiary. Scale reduced some risks, but it multiplied others. The organization became strong enough to absorb businesses and too complex to understand them with equal depth. Janine's legacy lies in that contradiction. He helped demonstrate how systems of reporting, managerial authority, and acquisition could reshape the boundaries of the modern corporation. He also exposed the limits of treating management as a universal technology. The methods that created order across a growing empire could not eliminate the differences between the businesses inside it. The historical lesson is more precise than the claim that conglomerates simply failed. They solved a real problem: how to allocate capital and coordinate many companies under one corporate structure. Their weakness was assuming that coordination was equivalent to understanding. Once that assumption spread, acquisition became both a growth strategy and a test of managerial ideology. Corporate America retained parts of Janine's model even after the conglomerate boom lost its authority. Centralized finance, performance metrics, portfolio management, and disciplined capital allocation remained influential. What changed was the confidence that every business belonged together merely because one headquarters could measure it. The era's most durable invention was not the empire, but the management infrastructure built to govern it. Harold Janine reshaped corporate growth by converting expansion into an administrative system. Under ITT, the corporation became a laboratory for the idea that unrelated businesses could be assembled, measured, and directed as one enterprise. The rise of that model revealed the power of managerial coordination. Its fall revealed something equally important. Numbers can connect a corporation, but they cannot erase the economic realities that make each business distinct.